Good afternoon. On Friday, we looked at the book of Genesis, had a review of the book. We looked at the ways that we can memorize the days of creation in the he forms, he fills pattern. And then we looked at the rest of the book, how you can see in the first 11 chapters the five main events, and then in chapters 12 through 50, the five main people that the book is going to talk about. Today, we want to kind of do something similar with the book of Exodus, see the structure of this book, see how it works, and the story that it ultimately tells. And the first thing we want to see is that, like Genesis, it is divided into two parts. Now, Genesis doesn't do that evenly. Genesis goes chapters 1 through 11 and then chapters 12 through 50. Exodus does this closer to half. In chapters 1 through 19, you see Israel in Egypt and Israel coming out of Egypt. And then in chapters 20 through 40, you see Israel at Mount Sinai. And so this one is more evenly divided into these two halves. This is a bifid composition, is what it's referred to. So I want to look at this outline and expand on it just a little bit here. So in the first half of the book, you see Israel in Egypt and coming out of Egypt. We know about the trouble that arises in Egypt because of the growth of the Israelites there. We see about the birth and the salvation of Moses as his parents make sure that he is saved. He is taken into Potiphar's house. We know this story. In chapters 3 and 4, we see the preparation of Moses to become the leader of the people. Remember, he becomes a shepherd, kind of out in the wilderness. God calls him from the burning bush. God instructs him on what he is going to be doing, and God gives him the signs that he is going to need to perform before Pharaoh to ultimately convince him to allow the people to leave. In chapters 5 and 6, we see Moses and Aaron's return to Egypt. And then the big portion of this section where we usually focus our attention is in Exodus 7 through 13, the confrontation with Pharaoh. We usually refer to this as the 10 plagues. And then we see God delivering the people from Egyptian bondage. He takes them into the wilderness, and we see their salvation in the wilderness. And he saves them numerous times in the wilderness as well. In this section, we see him save the people at the Red Sea. We see him save the people from hunger. We see him save the people from thirst as he gets them to Mount Sinai. That, of course, is the second part of this book, is Israel at Mount Sinai. We see the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, kind of the foundation principles of the law. We see in chapters 20 through 24 some various laws, the ratification of the covenant. If you look at this, sometimes it does appear very random, thus the phrase various laws. We see in Exodus 25 through 31 an emphasis on the building of the tabernacle and getting the priest ready to serve in the tabernacle. And then, of course, we have the golden calf incident in Exodus 32 and 33, and that's going to be a major deal in this story. In chapters 34 through 40, we see the building of the tabernacle. And while this is kind of boring reading, it is of great importance in the biblical story and what God is wanting with his people. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. And then in chapter 40, we see that God's glory fills the tabernacle. And so that's kind of a typical outline, something you're going to find in commentaries or introductions to the Bible. That is a typical outline that you will find of Exodus. I want to share with you an outline that my friend Jared showed me, Jared Saltz. He's a professor at Florida College. And what he is emphasizing in this outline is not every single little detail that happens, but the overarching purpose or themes that we see in the book of Exodus. And I really appreciate this outline and what's going on here. So we have really two crises in the book of Exodus. And the first one is that Israel has the wrong master, and that is in Egypt. We see that God hears their plea, that God saves Israel from Egypt. Notice that this is kind of using bigger chunks of text here to see these themes. And then we see that God plans to dwell with Israel. I will be your God and you shall be my people. Well, we're going to see this same four-step pattern repeat itself in the rest of the book. We have a second crisis now. This time, Israel has chosen the wrong master. This time, they've chosen the calf. We know that story. God hears Moses' plea. Remember, Moses puts himself in the gap, in the breach. He stands between God and the people as a good intercessor should. God hears Moses' plea and God preserves Israel from death. And then we see that God again plans to dwell with Israel. And then the overall capstone on all of this is that in chapter 40, God dwells with Israel. The tabernacle has been completed and God moves in, if you will, to the tabernacle, and his glory is there. And the text says that all the people can see it. And so you have kind of your typical outline, and then you have this theological outline, kind of what are the real emphases, what's the real point that we want to get out of this book. And so I thank Jared for this outline. I think it's very good and very helpful. And then I want to just close with some keys in Exodus, just some things that we should keep in mind as we go through the book to help us understand what's going on. In Exodus 1 through 7, we have a listing of the names of Jacob's sons. In verse 5, it talks about the 70 persons who were going to come down to Egypt. And we read in verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now we understand that that is going to set up some of the drama in the book of Exodus, but we see that that is one of the fulfillments, or a fulfillment to one of the promises that God makes to Abraham. And so right at the very beginning of the book, we see connections to Genesis, which is extremely important. In verse 8, I think we get a historical key to understanding the book. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Well, remember, Joseph had saved Egypt. Egypt owes their existence to Joseph because he was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. So there comes a time later of a king who doesn't know Joseph. I don't think that's a literal knowing. Oh, well, I've never heard of Joseph. Who is that? I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's a guy who didn't care about Joseph and didn't care about Joseph's people. All he saw was the threat of these people to his nation. So there's the historical key. And in Exodus 6, verses 6 through 8, I think we have the theological key to the book. Exodus 6, starting at verse 6, say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you will know that I am the Lord your God who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. So we have our historical key, we have our theological key. We get to Exodus 7 through 13, and what we see is this battle, if you will, between God and Pharaoh. Really, it's God, Yahweh, between or between God Yahweh and the gods of Egypt. Egypt had a pantheon of gods. They had gods for everything. And what we see in some of the plagues is God's power and control over the realms of life that these Egyptian gods were supposed to have power over. And we see that it's really God who has this power. And so he shows the gods of Egypt to be inept. He shows them to be weak. He shows them to really be non existent. And this is a powerful point that the Israelites need to learn and need to understand as they are going to become a new people, as they are going to have to learn to trust in God. Somebody is taking off in a motorcycle at this point in time. In a few passages here, we see maybe the main theme of the book. And as I study more about Scripture, the more I'm convinced it's probably the theme of the whole Bible. And that is that God wants a relationship with his people. In Exodus 19 at verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. And then in chapter 29 at verse 45, he says, I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. And then the very last verse of the whole book in Exodus chapter 40, after they built the tabernacle, God's glory has moved into the tabernacle. We read in Exodus 40 at verse 38. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. And so we see that God, yes, in a limited fashion, is dwelling with his people. And it's just a taste of what is to come, what God plans to accomplish by his Son, Jesus Christ. They have that in shadow form, to borrow the language of the Hebrew writer. And so we see the connection between Genesis and Exodus, and we see how it is going to be pointing forward to Jesus Christ. That is what all of this is here to do. So I hope this gives you some things to think about. I hope it will help you maybe see the shape of Exodus in your mind. These rather large books, especially when you get to the major prophets, there's so much there. It's kind of hard to know what's going on, to see what the flow of the book is. Hopefully this will help you in that regard, and maybe will be some benefit in remembering what is going on in this powerful, wonderful book. We'll see you in the next couple of days as we look at the book of Leviticus.